Cheers. Thank you, Anthony. I guess I should point out that when me and Anthony first discussed doing the series of Century of Violence, and I had this, this conversation around doing it, the first book which came to mind was Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. And that was the first book which came on the list as the absolute must-go-to book that we need to deal with over the past century of violence. The second name, which I wrote down after that, was Lewis's, because I thought if we're going to deal with Fanon, then there's nobody better, and who has actually put Fanon's ideas to work better than Lewis. And maybe just as a brief anecdote before we get into the conversation, I met Lewis in 2010 for the very first time, and I was at the process of setting up a new filmed-based web project, which eventually became what was called the Histories of Violence project. And I first met Lewis for lunch at a place called the Royal Armouries in Leeds, where if you want to understand the history of colonial violence, just go to the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds. And we sat down and Lewis kindly agreed to give a filmed discussion on Fanon. We did the filming the next day. Lewis turned up without any notes whatsoever and just gave an hour-long lecture as if he was reading perfectly from a script. And that became the basis of the very first film that we actually uploaded to the Histories of Violence project. So I'm very deeply indebted to Lewis for that participation. And I'm obviously it's great to be speaking with you again, Lewis, today. So.
Oh, it's great to see you, Brad. It's great to see you.
Great.
And to the audience, all you, hello, great to see a lot of you. Winnikisuk, which is Wampanoag, speaking about violence, right? Mm-hmm. Wampanoag, those are the people who greeted the pilgrims here in New England. Mm-hmm. And as we know, their kindness wasn't reciprocated. And to many others, it's striking that there are ways we greet one another, right? Hotep, Shalom, Assalamu Alaikum. The very fact that we would say peace. Although I should add that in Hebrew, and then also Medu Neter in ancient East African, the Kemetan, known as Egyptian language, peace is not about simply the absence of war. Okay, and it relates, and Fanon understood that very well, but we could get to that. You could see I'm already riffing.
Yeah, great. Well, let's get into this, Luke, and I guess I'd be very keen, first of all, in terms of, what drew you to Fanon's work? And in particular, I'm wondering, how did you feel after you first read, well, I'd say The Wretched of the Earth, but I know you prefer the interpretation of The Damned of the Earth. So how did you first feel after you read that book? And what does that mean to you now, looking back?
Wow, well, it's really funny because the actual first text from Fanon I encountered was Pour Noir Masse Blanc, Black Skin, White Mass. And what it was, and that one I didn't understand what the hell was going on because I was 11 years old. Mm-hmm. However, the writing was just so beautiful. Mm-hmm. However, with this text, and look at the tattered copy this was in the living room. It was brought home by my uncles. One of them, Emil Solomon. We know him today as Salim Solomon. I have these Rastafarian uncles who love to buy books but don't read them. And but the thing is, having books in the home is great because the child might read them. And I picked up this text and I understood this one. Mm-hmm. And later on, when a wonderful middle school teacher by the name of Fearman, she gave me the autobiography of Malcolm X, and reading Fanon's, we know this title, The Wretched of the Earth. The reason I'm critical of that title is because Fanon did not consider the population. He's talking about wretched. Mm-hmm. And also the mythopoetics of his language. He's thinking about damnation because one could be condemned even though one is innocent. Mm-hmm. One could be condemned although one has done nothing wrong. And a lot of the dynamics of colonialism is about what is imposed upon a people, which is dehumanization, without any action of their own causing it. So that's why I prefer damned. And I also think analytically it works better. But my encounter was there, you have to picture, in the Bronx, dealing with the realities and the stark, violent realities, especially when you deal with busing. You could imagine in my adolescent years coming out of school and seeing 6 blocks of white people with weapons, yelling N-words and so forth at children trying to go to school. Or if one were to just look around the contradictions of the society. It's not only me, by the way. Robert Burt, the philosopher who was at Morgan State, said a similar thing. He said when he lived in the housing projects in the States, because the States, again, in the United States, there was something rather profound, I remember, as an immigrant child, which is in Jamaica, where I'm from, if somebody's poor, you work with them to see what you can do. There's a collective responsibility to make the world better. There's a sense that being poor doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. And I remember when I, being poor, went to school and my mother got me some cheap sneakers. And I realized American kids will make fun of you for not being able to afford expensive things. And I realized I was in a country that hated the poor. There's something bizarre to me about hating the poor. And Robert Burt said a similar thing. He said, because in many other countries, public housing is also livable. It's decent. But public housing in the United States, or countries that hate the poor, is to make them as volatile, as punitive as possible. So when he looked at Fanon's Manichaean description of the settlers community and the colonized community, and he looked in the projects at his own condition, he immediately had that identification. And so I could tell you, my uncle did something powerful by making sure that was there. And to think about it, it's not about whether you're any gifted child or anything like that. Just Fanon was speaking to you regardless of age, color, race, class, whatever. That powerful way he opened this book had me, as we say, from line one.
Well, I'd love to return to some of this in a bit, Lewis, and particularly around the question of race and class, and also actually the beautiful poetry of Fanon's book. And I actually love that description you talk about, actually, about just the spontaneous lived presence of a book and not knowing who's going to pick it up, or knowing that somebody's going to pick it up at some point in history, I think is, really powerful. But I'd like to just focus, first of all, on this question of violence a bit more. And again, one of the things I've always been taken by your work is the way in which you kind of push against a lot of the kind of contrite readings of violence in Fanon. And I'm wondering, how do you think we should think of violence in Fanon's thought? And especially in the contemporary moment as well, what does Fanon's thought bring to our understanding of violence in the world today, as much as it did when he was writing it?
Oh, man. Short answer, a lot.
Yeah.
Short answer, a lot. But there's several things. The first thing is, you could imagine, how so many people just freaked out that there's this Black man unapologetically talking about violence. And, it had this weird response. On the one hand, there are two words in anti-Black societies that you don't want to have together. The first word is, the couplet is Black and power. And that is because in those societies, they have a slippery slope in their thinking that if you put Black and power together, it immediately means violence. Even though history has shown, sadly, I know right now, DeSantis and others are trying to block history, but no group of people, and it's not that we have to, and this is not about something intrinsic in white people, but no group of people have committed more violence on humankind than the people we designated white. And so if people should be trembling to put the words white and power together. But this is because of a bizarre psychoanalytical projection. If there's a history of being so gruesome, the genocide of the indigenous peoples across North America, the efforts in Asia, the treatment of people in Africa, the whole gory, horrible situation, and the many who died at sea in the slave trade, et cetera, there's a presumption, there's a projection that, wow, it'll be payback. So there's this constant effort to tell Black people to avoid even using the V word, violence. In my recent book, Fear of Black Consciousness, I opened up with a story about violence. about a little white boy who was calling me the N-word, and I was fresh from Jamaica and didn't know what it meant. And when I figured out, I basically kicked his ass. And it struck me when the teacher was trying to explain to me that there was something wrong with me in doing so. I said, maybe you should explain to this guy not to be treating immigrant children this way. But what I reflected in that opening is that, Black people are always being told to do what many white people will never do. If white people were humiliated or treated the way people of color are treated, we've seen the response has always been violence. Now, this is not to romanticize violence, but it's to bring up something crucial, because what I said there, and this is what Fanon said that freaked people out, that there are circumstances in which you should stand up for yourself and fight, even if you lose. Because Fanon saw a form of psychosis that would emerge when there's an absolute sense of unworthiness of the self. Now, Fanon himself, and Ali Shirky is absolutely correct with this, he hated violence. He absolutely hated it. But his position was that what he hated more was complicity with violence through a refusal to do something. So for Fanon, and we know in Pas Noir, Masse Blanc, and Black Skin, White Mass, he said it's about being actional. For Fanon, when he's talking about violence, he's actually not talking about it in a dichotomous black-white way. He's saying that human beings, for instance, in my What Fanon Said book, I pointed out that one of the big issues that Fanon got embroiled in was a case around domestic violence. So it's around gender violence. Fanon's position is that if you intervene, if you do something about violence, one has to take seriously that the violator rationalizes his, her, or their action as intrinsically legitimate, which means that your effort to transform it is treated as intrinsically illegitimate or a violation. And as a consequence, you would be structured as the violent one. The fact that he's writing in the context of settler colonialism, no settler takes the position that the land he, she, or they purchased, or, by the point after conquest is done, was illegitimate. None of them take the position they're doing anything wrong. So for them, those who are trying to get, whether it's the land back or to have the return of control of the institutions of power, those people are harming them. So what Fanon was pointing out around this question of violence is a form of tragedy in which the notion of a kind of intrinsic innocence is thrown to the wayside. And many liberal models, which he was criticizing, which also Biko later, Steve Biko, Bantu Biko later criticized, a lot of these models basically impose a kind of deontological or rightness-oriented model that actually preserves the status quo. And so what Fanon was saying in a very sober, mature, and scary way is basically, grow up. If you want to live in a world in which people treat people better, you're going to have to understand that fighting for it is going to mean being structured as having dirty hands. And so what he was doing multiple things in his analysis of violence. He was pointing out the irrelevance of trying to demonstrate you're nonviolent. And this is precise. And how do you demonstrate you're nonviolent if you're part of a group in which the society has determined should not appear? In other words, if you're in the realm of illicit appearance, it's almost illegal for you to appear. Then how do you fight for, or even it doesn't even have to be a fight. How do you walk in and say, excuse me, I have a right to exist? That very polite effort is a violation of the decent, the licit sphere.
Mhm.
And so if you're going to fight against dehumanization, disempowerment, you will be struggling for empowerment, humanization, but humanization paradoxically, because the argument is not you're becoming a human being. The argument is that the violence was denying your humanity. So what you're actually saying is that you are a human being, but a human being cannot exist in isolation. The human being is a relationship with phenomena through which that humanity can upsurge, appear, be sheared. And in a world that wants to separate them, a world that structures a form of apartheid, a world that tries to make sure that there's no interaction, then the very notion of interaction has now been made illicit and violent. And ironically, Fanon was bringing in the idea of humanity as a dialectical reality, which makes violence, colonialism, structurally forcing a world of contraries.
Mhm.
So that means, ironically, you notice even today, there are people freak out if you say dialectics, right? But Fanon is actually arguing that dialectical interaction in a world of segregation and colonialism is treated as violence itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I guess, I agree with you completely. I think actually Fanon's a far better dialectical thinker than Marx ever was, for instance. And I also think that what you explained, Lewis, in terms of the thing I always get from Fanon's work is, I think he's the first to make properly explicit this idea of the psychic life of violence in a way that is, I think, unrivaled in terms of the way he writes it prior to that. I'm kind of, interested in kind of pushing this a bit in terms of how this connects, especially to your work on fear of Black consciousness as well, because I know, when you were talking about that experience you had when you were younger, it kind of reminded me of something you wrote about also as the seminal moment in Fanon's life, where he sees the autopsy of a corpse. And this becomes a kind of existential moment for Fanon. And I'm kind of wondering how you think about this link then between, the fearness of Black consciousness. And I know you've also written about, for instance, there's no necessarily a fear of Black bodies in so much as they become overly fetishized through athletes and so on and so forth. But what becomes truly problematic from the operations of power is existential consciousness. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate a bit more on that, especially in how that draws from Fanon and the violence and, in terms of thinking about maybe a kind of radical humanism beyond that. So.
Sure. I mean, well, there's several things. Yes, I talk about that there are people who actually don't really fear, there's a lot of talk about Black bodies. But basically what the society would prefer would be Black bodies with a white mind or Black bodies with a white consciousness, which is beautifully portrayed in Jordan Peele's Get Out. He does it wonderfully there. But the thing with Fanon is that Fanon was a radical humanist. But by a humanist, what he meant by this was not the idea of a kind of species privilege or species fetishism. What he meant by this, and this is, you're absolutely right, what Fanon brought up and understood very well, is that one of the fantasies of the Euromodern world is the idea that legitimacy depends on looking at humanity from the outside, but which is already a performative contradiction. In other words, the moment you're in an intersubjective relationship, you're in a world that's inside, because humanity lives in a world of meaning. And part of violence, he looks at violence in a very multi-layered way. So it's not simply about the question of force, because you could hit your toe and it hurts when you get up early in the morning out of bed, but that's not violence. However, if you get up out of bed and your partner's pissed at you, put their foot out and you trip on the floor, that's violence. So the thing is, the internality, the connection, the intersubjectivity, the world of meaning, right? When human beings are pushed out of that world into our body by itself, and then the disembodiment of the body, in other words, the collapse of the body from lived body into corporeality, then that's the realm of the corpse. But Fanon, what struck me about Fanon is that he's even more radical, because when he was 14 years old, he went to witness a autopsy of a woman who was killed by an automobile. And he was disgusted by it, but it wasn't the gore. What disgusted Fanon was the very matter-of-factness, the very indignity over which this woman's corpse was handled. And this is rather an interesting element in Fanon, because he is bringing, I argue, he's bringing up something that's already linked in creolized languages. Although he spoke French, in Martinique, they had Creole, and a lot of African and indigenous Creole languages, they're mixed in, they're more verb, living, meaning-based languages. In other words, they're not property, lock-based languages. And this means that even in death, because as you know, in many African systems, it's not like just death. There is a relationship to death is a kind of transformation to becoming an ancestor, which means that even the dead have rights. And this connection, and as you know, with violence, you need to have a right and rights in there. There has to be a sense that you're entitled not to be treated a certain way. And so for Fanon, that entitlement not to be treated a certain way continues even in death. And that's why he was disgusted at the inhumanity in the process of the autopsy. And this is something that stuck with him even in medical school, because his professor, he famously said to him, how am I going to get through anatomy? And the professor said, it's a cat. And I often quip, the cat was like, why not a mouse? And it goes on. But the point there is that the professor was saying dehumanize it. And of course, the insight is the processes of dehumanization we use that enable us to commit all kinds of actions on another, right? The key to that is already there, if we could see in language, for instance, when we have to rename people in order to harm them, rename institutions to destroy them, rename. But it's not just at the level of language. There's an extent to which the implicit notion is that once the humanity is erased, there's a presupposition that all is permitted. And this was the insight. But that understanding is through being in a world of meaning, the subjective relationship with the other. And very quickly, because I know we're short on time, an insight Fanon had around this is that, there are people who often argue against the notion of the other. I don't want to be the other, right? And Fanon basically pointed out something, that there's an ambiguity in the notion of other. And the ambiguity, of course, is that the other is another human being. We don't say look at the chair as the other. You see, the other is a freedom with whom one communicates. The other is a producer of meaning. So Fanon would argue, actually, in the phenomenological tradition, that others are necessary conditions for the appearance of social reality. And as Levinas and many others have seen, or rather argued, that this other also has ethical implications, because it makes you realize you're also another, and it also enables you to take responsibility for the relationship with others. But what violence does, what dehumanization does, is to say there's not even an other. And this radicality that Fanon pointed out, and this is later on, he says it in Le Damnés de la Terre, everybody else knows it, in English is Wretched of the Earth, but he says it later on that, look, in the wars in Europe, although they had enemies, they were fighting one another. They were fighting one another as others. And thus, a Frenchman fighting a German did not mean that the Frenchman, did not mean that the German was not a human being, or the Frenchman was not a human being. Same with the British versus, with the English, the whole situation in World War II when they were fighting Germans. But you could see the more graphic example of this when American soldiers who were fighting in World War II were put in the colored section, and even Nazi POWs were put in first class in trains in the US or across Europe. And that's because they remained irrevocably human beings. So what Fanon was identifying here then is that the kind of phenomena we're talking about, the more radicality, in that the radicality that's involved in dehumanization is linked into the production of violence. And there are other theoretical reasons that's at work here, mainly because, for instance, right now, the language to soften it, if we talk about, for instance, police violence, is to say, police use of force, excessive use of force. That is to basically take away the question of wrongful use of force. And as we know, that wrongful use puts it into the realm of violence. And this is one of the reasons why, for instance, it's so difficult to deal with the police under these kinds of circumstances. So yeah, the basic thing with Fanon then is to understand that when we are talking about violence, we are fundamentally talking about the disruption of the intersubjective relations through which we are able to produce our common humanity. We are talking about dehumanization.
Yeah. And it's interesting when you were talking about the others, I was reminded the way in which the Zapatistas would affectionately call about others. And the other actually features very prominently in their discourses and writings. They don't disavow the other. It becomes a very central motif actually in their politics. And I'm kind of, I think for me, when I read, and I want to bring this back to the question of dialectics as well, because the one line which always struck me, especially as a white European, right, when I was reading The Wretched of the Earth, was that single line that Europe is literally the creation of the third world. And I think that was the most striking line for me. It was like, okay, right, I'm going to have to deal with this reality. I'm just wondering how you kind of, think of that line, especially, because the more I read that, the more I also recognize the importance of the interplay in Fanon between race and class, and they're inseparable, I think. And I'm wondering how you think of that now, especially in the contemporary moment. I'm always baffled when I look at, like, for instance, the political terrain in the United States of America, where there's these dialectical divisions between Black and white communities and the racialization of white communities, where these communities have so much more in common than what they ever do with the leaders. And how do you make sense of that in the context of that, that division which Fanon recognizes as the construct of Europe creating the third world, and how that filters back then into the United States of America and in the contemporary politics today?
You just said a mouthful.
Yeah.
It's no, it's quite a lot. But my translation of that section, I mean, in the original French, by the way, I showed my tattered original English version here, but if you look at the French version, my translation of it is as follows: Europe is literally the creation of the third world. The riches that choke her are that which was stolen from the underdeveloped peoples. The ports of Holland, the docks of Bordeaux and Liverpool specialize in the slave trade and owe their renown from millions of deported slaves. So when we hear a European head of state declare with hand on his heart that he must help poor underdeveloped peoples, we do not tremble with gratitude. Rather, we say, quote, it's just reparations owed to us, unquote. The thing about it, the thing with Fanon we should always bear in mind is that Fanon had a very, very important insight that some people today overlook. I mean, he was a radical anti-Manichaeist, okay? He was against reductivism. And, the reason when he wrote Black Skin, White Mass, he was talking about two kinds of lies. The lie that Black people are intrinsically inferior, and the lie that white people are intrinsically superior. Both lies, he argues, are the attempted murder of humanity. I mean, think of that language, attempted murder of humanity. And so what he was saying is that the very production of a global colonial system creates a group of people who have to wear masks and live a lie. That's whiteness. He's not talking about individual white people. He's talking about what white people are, what's projected on what white people should be. Say, with Black people, right? The notion of being sealed in the skin of inferior to brown people, etc. And what Fanon was saying there, and he makes it very explicit throughout Le Damné de la Terre, right? The Damned of the Earth, is that even though there is a conflict, we must remember that it's a conflict going on between groups of human beings, right? In other words, there is a system that could make white people forget they're people. There's a system that could make Black people, and he says it outright in the book. He says eventually it makes people ask, well, what the hell am I? Who am I? And so if we're going to look at what he's arguing right now in terms of the anti-woke, anti-critical race theory, anti all the antis out there, they're an effort basically to seal, to put more glue onto the masks, the lies. And what he's saying is that we should face history. He's saying that a classic psychoanalytical move, which is, you know, there are people who are haunted by ghosts. And the point, and ghosts usually pop up mainly because you haven't done what you're supposed to do. Right? Ghosts are always by definition from the past or from somewhere there, from another time. And if you're able to handle those issues from the time, you're able not only to exercise the ghosts, but you're also able to live with the possibilities because you're no longer enshackled, but at the same time, you can relate to the history the way you can say when you pass a graveyard. Okay. So the thing right now that Fanon would say is, look, we're living on a planet, 8 billion people. It's smaller than it was even in his time. The technologies of movement, the fact that we can be speaking from different shores, different states, different places. There's a compressed humanity. That intersubjectivity is there. And right now, what are we doing wasting all of our time with this kind of a structure of the idea of absolutes, white, Black, and brown? Now, of course, there is something we have to take seriously, the concepts that maintain them. For instance, the concept of privatization by definition means that there are people who are excluded. The concept of a nation state by definition means that there's the production of illegal people. There are lots of concepts that converge, and what happens is when we distort them, we fail to see their connectedness. I've argued that Fanon has always been a more psychoanalytically oriented phenomenological structuralist. And even though that's all kinds of technical language, it basically comes down to this. Nothing is meaningful outside of a relationship. And so as much as we may be pissed off or fighting with one another, we cannot have any solution that's not a solution of building new relationships. And that means that relationality, that ability to produce new relationships, also will produce new kinds of people, new concepts. And this element then is something that is a crucial aspect of the book. And, you know, we think of the North-South elements, we think of the racial elements, those are all there. They're all there. But one of the lies that we inherit is the lie of ontological or absolute fixedness. The idea that there will be, first of all, the idea that there have always been white people, well, no. The idea that there have always been Black people, no. And right now, the world we're living, we're seeing new kinds of people pop up every year, every day. There are new kinds of people. And the question we face then is the question of the responsibility we have as people dealing with new kinds of people. And the realization that as much as we're thinking that the others are the new kind of people, one day we may look in the mirror and realize, no, that new kind of people is us.
Yeah, I'm just kind of slightly just glanced at the time, Lewis. I realized already we've kind of gone into close to the ending, and it's. Yeah, I always, whenever I chat with you, I always feel like I'm just starting the conversation, and we could kind of go on for hours. I guess I'd just like to ask you maybe just very quickly. I really liked what you were talking. I think there's so much we could carry on through that, ideas of ghosts, and it was also reminding me of the book you wrote of divine warning and monsters, and there's so much we could elaborate on this. But I would like to just maybe end, if you can end maybe quickly here, so we can open it up to questions around. And I think one of the things that always really struck me as deeply important around your engagement with Fanon was, first of all, the question of the ancestral, but also the poetic, and how the poetry of Fanon. And I thought that was what, for me, that was always what you were doing very originally, that nobody else was doing with Fanon. And I wonder if you can just give a few comments on why you think that poetic element to Fanon is crucial to our understanding of him.
Sure. I mean, yeah. Well, first of all, he himself was a poet.
Yeah.
Especially when one reads his plays, they're basically in verse. Okay, but that's superficial. Okay, the deeper argument is, you notice every time I try to talk about what a human being is in Fanonian terms, it's never reduced to a single element. He looks at human beings multidimensionally, and in fact, this book, Le Damné de la Terre, The Damned of the Earth, The Wretched of the Earth, is about what happens to human beings when our multidimensionality is eroded, when we close off those aspects of ourselves. So for Fanon, for instance, the affective life, the poetic dimensions of life, the mythopoetics, those are elements of life that are necessary for livable lives for human beings. To put differently, fine, you give us food, shelter, clothing. You take away the aesthetic dimension of life, the ambiguity of meanings, the creativity, you take away dance, you take away the musicality, you will have human beings who then go walk off of cliffs. In other words, the revolution, and he's absolutely a revolutionary, but Fanon doesn't have any room for revolutions that kill humanity. Fanon is arguing, a lot like Audre Lorde, that we need to build better houses in which people could live. And that livability is the poetic dimension that he talks about. So yeah, there are people who create the false dilemma between the historicists, and that Fanon is a kind of just materialistic, reductionistic type. No. The man danced, loved life, loved living, and he argues that every human being deserves that. And the political struggle, the revolutionary struggle, is to increase the options available for human beings to live meaningful lives.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lewis. And it also reminded me when you were speaking, actually, the lecture I've seen you give about when you talk about the difference between European music and African music, and how there's a different rhythm to life and how that feeds into a politics. But I'm sure we can elaborate on that as well. But thank you so much as always, Lewis. And I will pass over to Anthony, who I'm sure can moderate the questions.
Sure, and just very quickly, yeah, thank you, Anthony. But very quickly, I argue against the colonial view of European music because, for instance, to my Irish brothers and sisters out there, Jewish, there's been a long history of more creative, open European forms of music, but colonialism basically intervened and said, cut it out. Be reductive, square, and get rid of that rhythm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I'll just get cracking straight in there. So there's a question from Mirella, who notes that earlier you said that Fanon is not a romantic of violence, and is wondering if you mean this in opposition to people like Nietzsche or Robespierre. Can you please tell us how it differs from, how Fanon's conception differs from someone who does romanticize violence?
Great. And I think the questions are as important as the conversation. Could we have two more read out? That way the audience could get to hear them.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, if you want to go for the multiple question approach. So there's a question from Arthur, who asks, Fanon advocates for violent decolonization in The Wretched of the Earth. Do you believe he takes this position explicitly because of the nature of his surroundings during the time? And do you think that we now live in a time where all political confrontations can be resolved in a diplomatic way? And then a question from Urja, who asks, could you say more about one's relationship with the quote, others who may be your fellow natives, where obviously there's a possibility that there's not going to be dehumanization in that realm, but in a situation of colonization, how is your relationship with your fellow countrymen impacted? So how about those for 3 starters?
Sure. Sure. Okay. In terms of the first one, Fanon, the very short answer is Fanon would say the rah, 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 macho violence, type. They need therapy. Okay. For Fanon, because that's overcompensation for a profound level of insecurity. And indeed, the critical remarks I made earlier about, from the point of view of the people who have been toppled over by the violence over the past 500 years, what the violators don't realize is that the people who have been dominated are really shocked at the level of insecurity of the people who dominate them. And then, so at a basic level, people who bully people who are dealing with narcissistic disorders, etc., that kind of violence is really ultimately an effort to evade the self. And so, and we could see right now as people who are trying to fight against unveiling the truth about that history, the fact that they have really, hunkered down to try to keep the lies going is because the truth really hurts. And the truth comes down to a basic fact that we're talking about people who are not on the right side of history. It's just not being on the right side of history to commit genocide, to privatize the world in such a way that the vast majority of people on the planet would be in poverty. A lot of these things are wrong. And this is not, this is something, it's not, the argument is that it's not intrinsically connected, say, to white people or, Northern people or so forth. There are lots of circumstances, and this is where Fanon's work as a therapist is very important. There are lots of people in circumstances are doing things that they didn't even intend. They get in situations and one day they wake up and they realize, oh my God, I'm the oppressor. And then there are people who really are pretty effed up. That is their intention. But the point is, there's not a single blanket answer there. In terms of how we can get, the other two are really connected. If we come to them, the mistake people make when they read this book, right, is that they think this book is really about Europeans, right? And that's because a lot of people read Sartre's preface, okay? But because Sartre was trying to get Europeans to read it. The book is actually a book that is actually, and its most biting criticisms are actually internal, because what he argues, he says in the beginning, all decolonization is violent. But what he means by that is that the people who are, as I said earlier, the settlers, take the position that what they've created is just. So to get rid of it is treated as intrinsically unjust. And that's why Fanon said it's just a replacement of one group of people by another group of people. That's all. That's the violence. However, Fanon is actually, he's saying, although decolonization is necessary, he's saying it's insufficient. In other words, the problem Fanon's saying, and if I make it in just very plain language, is the game. And the problem is decolonization replaces the players, but doesn't change the game. Revolution is to change the game. And what is the game that's to be changed? Well, if there's a game that's premised on structural violence, ongoing violence, that's what colonialism is. That's the game you need to get rid of. You need a different game. And here's the problem. In then what's called the post-colonial state, right? In other words, fine, you get to throw out a group of people who used to call themselves masters. If you're going to beat your chest and say, now we're the masters, you're playing the same game. It's like the movie The Black Panther, right? When Killmonger says, it's just about conquerors and the conquered, and he wants to be the conqueror. Well, who says that those are the only options in town? Why not get rid of a system of having conquerors and conquered? If you get rid of that kind of a system, maybe now you can build new relations. So the problem, most of the book is about the generation whose skill set was to usher in the replacement, right? their skill set is very different from the skill sets of the people needed to build a new game, a better society. And the problem is the people who are trying to do this, the subsequent generations, right? In more concrete language, they got rid of the previous governors, but they've kept the institutions of power intact. They're not creatively rethinking government, the economic relations. They're not rethinking the educational systems. All these many ways in which new relations can produce a better way. Right now, for instance, at that time, they weren't thinking about the complexity of, say, gender and sexuality. But all of these things are what the new generations are thinking through, because they need to liberate those in order to live livable lives. But the problem is, if the previous governors see them are going to be stuck with the replacement theory, then they're in the way of the actual transformation into a more liberatory practice. So ultimately, what the colonized, the indigenous, whatever language we're using of the people, we're talking about to be liberated. The thing we must bear in mind is that they also need to be liberated from the very reductive conception of decolonization. This is what the book is about. The book is a warning. And in fact, Fanon often hoped he was wrong. But the warning is that, sure, those oppressors you consider your enemy, but you have a more profound enemy to deal with, which is the possibility that you may be your worst enemy. And you become your worst enemy if you block the capacity for different forms of living to emerge. And those different forms of living might be such that it's actually dealing with a more global humanity, right? Which would be a transformation of the very notion of masters and the dominated to begin with. You know, whenever Jane Gordon and I talk about the Audre Lorde, statement that master's tools don't tear down master's houses, Fanon relates to it in a beautiful way, because Fanon reminds us, masters don't build houses. Everyday people, workers, the people in the struggle do. So you got the tools, you got the energy, you got the skill sets. Now bring the creativity to build better houses.
Thank you very much, Lewis. So obviously there was 3 questions there and Lewis's response. Brad, do you have anything to pick up on?
Well, I guess just a couple of observations from what Lewis said, and I think the first point, actually, I'd like a qualification. I'm not necessarily sure Nietzsche does romanticize violence, but I don't want to take this into a conversation around Nietzsche. I think Lewis raises 2 really important points in terms of, I'd agree wholeheartedly with this idea that violence is often perpetrated by people from a position of inherent vulnerability and not from a position of strength, actually. And I'm interested in terms of, I know Lewis actually does this in his own work about then, not a suspicion so much as, but kind of a warning in terms of wedding emancipatory politics so much to the figure of the victim. And actually, a revolutionary movement needs to be so much more than just simply a narrative of victimization. But I'm really struck actually when Lewis was talking, and again, another such a powerful line, I think, in Fanon's Wretched of the Earth is, and the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And I think, to me, what I've always taken from that, and again, which I guess I would kind of connect also to the experience of the Zapatistas as well, is the revolution is not just the quintessential question of the Wretched of the Earth. I always see it as what happens the day after the revolution. And I think that, to me, is something which really strikes out. And again, I think Lewis can elaborate on this much better in terms of Fanon's thinking. But to me, that's always the question that's asked by that book. It's not about why revolution, but what happens the day after. And I think that, to me, is a real striking part of that narrative. So.
I totally agree, Brad. And yes, Nietzsche was not, he was being ironic the times when he talks about certain kinds of strength, etc. In fact, Fanon actually adored Nietzsche. In fact, even in his doctoral dissertation, the one that was accepted, he opened up with an epigraph from Nietzsche. And the point from Nietzsche that Fanon, he took several important points from Nietzsche. For instance, he was actually an advocate of the transvaluation of values. right? Fanon argues, for instance, that we should not be held hostage to a value system, but we should take responsibility for the values we build. Fanon also took very seriously Nietzsche's understanding of the idea that the human being is not a thing. The human being is a project, which means that you could have new human beings, different kinds. So that ending set afoot a new, new man. They put it in the translations that it should be a new humanity. But ultimately, again, for Nietzsche, humanity is a possibility, not a thing. So there's a lot they had in common there. And the thing, though, that, and you're absolutely correct, Brad, the point of the book is to point out that what colonialism does is to create a form of homelessness for people. In other words, it produces new kinds of people, but then tell them they don't belong. All right? The Black, as an example, is part of an epoch in which there's also this commitment against having Black people around. And there are all kinds of examples of these. So the thing that we have to take very seriously, in comedy, you could see it very well. I love that those scenes in comedy where there's a kind of fourth wall broken, where the camera is still going after everybody's happy that they won the battle. But, the party can't go on forever. Eventually, if it keeps going, people got to go home. And the problem is, of course, well, what is this home you go to? And Fanon beautifully articulates that freedom is multivalent. It's not, you can have liberty, but not freedom. To have freedom, you need more. And for freedom, you also need to have a place you belong. And not belong in the sense of a place that's confined to limit your capacity to grow, but belong as a place in which you actually now are what he calls a question mark. You have possibility. So home could be everything from your not only a domicile, but the relationships you have, the institutions through which you live, for those who have discovered their calling in their disciplines or their life's work, that's home. Home is many form, but you cannot have freedom properly, he argues as well, without a home. And the project is, if some people are going to say, look, I built the shiny house for you, that's not, you may say, yeah, but that's not really one I like to live in. So it's about saying you need to build the homes that are livable for you. And this is one of the things he's arguing for in the book.
Thanks so much, Lewis. That was a beautiful answer. I mean, we're pretty much at time, so I thought I'd just ask one final question, which is from Alice. I mean, in a sense, the whole talk's kind of been about it, but it's kind of quite a kind of an overview style question. So Alice asks, can you say something about Fanon as a thinker? What did his psychiatry training bring? What was the nature of his engagement with philosophy, and what were other inspirations to him as a thinker? I know you've touched on all of them, but I think it's an interesting question to finish with.
I gave a talk 2 weeks ago in Memphis around this. Fanon was a person who brought philosophy, psychoanalysis, and phenomenology together. And it's interesting, the genealogical line, because as we know, even in psychiatry, he studied two kinds of psychiatry: clinical psychiatry and forensic psychiatry. In other words, he was a medical detective. But one of the things that's interesting about Fanon is that Fanon really understood beautifully that the phenomenological move, in which one puts into suspension naive ontological or naive commitments about the way the world is, brings us into the world of meaning, through which we ask about what it is that to live a reality that is often covered over by false notions or reductive notions of what reality is. But then he makes another move. Fanon also, like Freud, took very seriously the question that within human existence, one has to deal with the question of meaning, want, desire, wish. And these are really crucial, because very quickly, they make us understand that we're creatures of vulnerability that require necessary conditions. We're also creatures of pleasure, but we're also creatures that we really need value. In other words, every human being, in order to live, needs to live in a world in which we're valued. And in the externalization of that value is what we call respect or legitimacy. And they take their ultimate form in the wish. And what is the wish? The wish ultimately takes the form of joy. Now, this aspect of Fanon, right, is a crucial element because it informs his understanding, his philosophical anthropology of what is to be a human being, but also informs the political elements, because when we're deprived of those things, and especially if we're dealing with conditions under which one is going to make, right, as the norm, options for some that will be forbidden for others, what we have is a situation of injustice. But when we deal with issues of justice, what we achieve is satisfaction when justice is achieved, but justice by itself is insufficient. And so if we bring them together, what Fanon understood is that beyond justice, there is the question of health. And this is where psychiatry, not just psychology, psychiatry comes in. Because the conundrum of colonial psychiatry is to try to make people at home in a world that dehumanizes them. Healthy psychiatry, good political practice, is to create a home in which people can be healthy, and in that health, in other words, at most at home in a world in which their humanity is ultimately affirmed through dignity and freedom. So they all come together in Fanon's thought. For him, they're not separated. Just like Brad's question about the poetic dimension of Fanon. For Fanon, all are interrelated.